Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame, where we delve deeper into the top stories not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyoung. Quite an alarming report has been released today by Statistics Korea. Among many indicators worth taking a look at, one is a sharp increase in the number of child abuse cases. As of 2021, the rate of child abuse cases among those aged under 17 recorded an all-time high of more than 500 per 100,000 children. That's a huge increase from previous figure of around 400. Why does the number of child abuse cases keep increasing? And is our society handling child abuse cases in an effective way? For an in-depth analysis on child abuse, we invite Cho Hee-kyung, professor of law from Hongik University, on the line. Professor Cho, welcome to the show.
Good evening.
And we also have Azam Marwa, barrister and mediator from Pantheon Chambers, on the line as well. He is an expert committed to child protection and rights and will let us know more about how other countries are dealing with the child abuse issue. Mr. Marwa, welcome and thank you for making your time.
Thank you for inviting me here to talk about this topic.
All right. Now, Mr. Marwa, I'd like to give you the first question. As a lawyer specializing in children, could you give us a clear definition of what child abuse is before we get into the details for our viewers? And within what legal boundary can we differentiate discipline or education from abuse? And what types of abuses are there?
Well, there's no single definition of child abuse accepted across jurisdictions, but most jurisdictions adopt a principled approach that's focused on the child. In 1999, the World Health Organization adopted a quite useful definition. It defined child abuse as all forms of physical or emotional ill treatment, sexual abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, or commercial or other exploitation resulting in actual or potential harm to a child's health, survival, development, or dignity in the context of a relationship of responsibility, trust, or power. Now, it was quite long, but you can see certain elements coming out of that. The first is the focus is on harm or potential harm to a child, regardless of the form of the maltreatment. But it also requires a relationship of power, trust, or responsibility between the child and the abuser. The focus is not on the motivation of the abuser, but on the relationship between the child and that person. Discipline, even if it's motivated by education, can still be abusive. Children need to be protected from harm, and this is why experts in child health and development are united in opposing discipline that results in harm to children.
Right, so the key focus is on harm and the relationship between the children and the parents. All right, Professor Cho, the number of child abuse cases reported is steadily increasing as awareness of the importance of reporting has grown. However, when it comes to the discovery rate, which shows how many cases are reported per 1,000 children, data shows South Korea at a little over 5.02 per 1,000 in 2021, while other countries are at much higher level. Now, why still so low in South Korea?
Well, we could engage in some wishful thinking and say that it's because there are fewer cases of child abuse, but statistically speaking, that's quite unlikely. I would say that given the rate of increase year on year in number of reported cases of child abuse, that's been steadily increasing since data have been gathering on this issue. I think people have become more aware of the issue of child abuse, and there are more reports being made of incidents because Korea traditionally has a very strong concept of what we call 친권, or if we translate it, it would be parental authority, but it's something that is much more broad and more encompassing than other concepts of, I think, parental authority. And so people are generally very reluctant to get involved or be in a parent admonishing or punishing or disciplining a child because they believe that it's within the purview of the parent's responsibility and authority and right to do so. And so, for example, most families live in apartment blocks, and even if you hear a child crying or screaming, the neighbors wouldn't automatically go to and call the police and report the case. So there is that. But as we've seen in terms of number of increase in the reports that are made and also cases that have been found to be involving child abuse, I think people are becoming more aware of the issue and more reports are being made. And particularly through the COVID period, because children have been stuck at home with parents for a long period of time, and the increased stress levels have often resulted in cases of child abuse. I think this has also become significant.
Right. So basically, it's because South Korea has a long tradition of acknowledging the parental authority. Now, Mr. Marwa, I'd like to move on to you. South Korea has mandated that people in certain jobs, such as teachers and doctors, to report child abuse if they notice it. Unfortunately, however, many of them say it is quite hard to report due to a lack of protection for them. And as far as I know, Hong Kong has made efforts to impose legal liability on adults who fail to report such child abuse. Now, how has Hong Kong imposed this rule, and how do you believe a mandatory reporting system should work?
Well, in fact, the Hong Kong government is in the midst of consultation and introducing legislation. They haven't done that yet. We face very similar problems to South Korea from those mentioned by Professor Cho. The views expressed by myself and other experts to the government, I'm glad to say some of them appear to be included in the proposed legislation. We take the view that there, one, should be very clear language describing what is and is not child abuse. Two, there should be very clear channels for reporting child abuse. Three, the duty should extend to professionals who work with children who have assumed duties towards children. There should be protections for those reporters, similar to what you mentioned. We've said that those protections should include immunity from lawsuits or retaliation from their employers or the parents. And there must also be public education and increased social welfare support for children and those who report child abuse. We also took the view that there should be an independent commission. I note that in South Korea, you have the Korean Human Rights Commission, which I think is a brilliant institution. We've often recommended that a similar organization should be providing support and monitoring implementation here in Hong Kong.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Cho, I'd like to dig a little deeper here. It is said around 40 children die annually on average from child abuse, and among them, more than half are under the age of 3. Why is government having trouble controlling the number of children under the age of 3 dying in this way?
So this number of 40 deaths annually from child abuse, that's also under a lot of question because, as we just discussed, we don't exactly know the number of actual cases of child abuse. And in fact, there might be deaths that we don't know of that have resulted from child abuse. So just recently, it has become mandatory that if a toddler dies, then there should be an autopsy to actually investigate the cause of death. Ever since there had been several cases of toddlers being essentially killed by those who are supposed to care for them. But that law has only been implemented recently, and we don't really know the effect of it yet. Now, as to the question of why more than 50% of those child abuse deaths occurred to very young children, it's because children under 3 are just simply less able to protect themselves, and they are much, much, much more vulnerable than teenagers or even preteens. For example, a blow or physical violence that might result in a broken rib for a teenager could quite easily kill a toddler under the age of 3. And with toddlers, they can't really express themselves. They can't really, escape to the neighbor to try to seek help. And also, if the caregiver to a toddler are not really experienced and they are not able to deal with their own emotions or stress, they are often liable to take out their stress and anger on the child. And the child simply becomes a helpless victim in those cases. And so this is why it's very, very difficult for a government to do something apart from really providing much more support to new parents and keeping a better lookout for these toddlers and having better support network, really.
Right, so the fact that they cannot express themselves are making them much more vulnerable to those kind of abuse and violence. Now, Professor Cho, I'd like to ask you one more. Another big problem is that nearly 85% of kids who are reported to have been abused are sent back home. And of the remaining cases, almost 20% of those who have been separated from their families temporarily are eventually returned home as well. Why is this so?
It's because there's no other feasible option. Unfortunately, we have very underdeveloped system of foster care, unlike some other countries. And so once a child who's a victim of child abuse is taken out of the care or the hands of the abuser, who are often the parents or primary caregivers, there's nowhere really for them to go. So foster care is very difficult. To become a foster parent, you have to go through so many hurdles that a lot of people give up. And our culture is such that once you actually accept a foster child, you often do so with the view that you're going to be a long-term carer for them. And so often children who are placed in foster care usually end up staying with the foster family until they become adults. And so there's very, very few foster families and foster opportunities that are available to the child. Now, what about institutions? So another option might be to send them to like a teenage shelters or even orphanages. But children who are at these institutions are often children who have been there since a very young age, and they're very used to institutional life, whereas a child who is taken out of an abusive environment and being placed in that kind of situation is completely unused to institutional life. And so the child, him or herself, might tell the caseworker after a few days, I'd rather go home. And institutions often are very reluctant to accept these children because they bring a lot of emotional, physical baggage with them, and they are not used to institutional life like other children, and so they are much more difficult to manage. And so this is why in a lot of cases, abused children end up going back to the original environment where they were abused. And so in order to break that cycle, we need to really provide better foster system, which we don't have.
Right, so it's because of the lack and shortage of the foster care system and the institutions. Now then, Mr. Marwa, what systems do other countries have in place to deal with the issue of children being returned to their families where they suffered abuse and are mistreated again?
Well, removing children from their families is generally a last resort because institutional care is no replacement for secure, loving families. Child abuse, as Professor Cho was suggesting, is often merely a symptom of other problems that arise within the family. Best practices in other countries usually involve regular family visits, family conferences to discover the challenges that create the risk of child abuse, and to discuss and implement welfare plans to protect the child going forward. Ideally, each child should be able to easily contact a specific social worker who works with them on a one-on-one basis so that the child knows where he or she can seek help. The best performing countries have understood that they really need to invest in enough social workers to actually implement welfare plans.
Right, so regular family visit could be one way for us to prevent further child abuse. Then Professor Cho, but there are still a lot of parents who mistreat them repeatedly, and some say the reason for such repeated child abuse is because of lenient criminal punishment. The data shows that less than half of the perpetrators accused are accused, and only 2% receive a criminal punishment from a court. Why is this? And compared to other countries, is this kind of level of sentencing appropriate in your opinion?
I think we actually have to look at punishment for child abuse, not in comparison to other countries, but in comparison to other crimes in Korea, because generally speaking, the criminal punishment levels in terms of prison sentences and penalties are relatively low compared to other countries. And so if you compare child abuse crimes to other type of crimes and punishment that are meted out to perpetrators, you can't really say that the punishment is light. So, for example, just last year, a young couple who essentially killed their 8-year-old daughter through abuse were given 30-year sentence, which may seem light in some other countries, but in Korean criminal justice system, it's quite a long sentence. But the question of why is it that such a low percentage of particularly parents receive criminal punishment, it comes back to the question of, well, who is going to look after the children? As the other commentator said, the best environment for the child is really to be with their family. And if the parent is the abuser and if the parent is sent to prison, then who is going to look after the child? That's a big question. We talked about foster care, we talked about institutions, and there are also relatives, but often relatives are sometimes also involved in the abusive situation. And so in many cases, there is actually no other real option but to return the child to the parent. And if the parent is incarcerated in a prison, it's not possible. And so this is why in cases where parents are the abusers, they often get suspended sentences. Now, if they were to get at the same time better support, better counseling, more training in terms of how to manage their own emotions and stress and how to really care for the child better, then that would be a much better outcome for everyone. But it seems that we don't really have the resources or the systems to implement it. And unfortunately, the vicious cycle seems to continue.
Right. Mr. Marwa, in order to root out continued child abuse cases, pundits say authorities should monitor the issue more preemptively rather than dealing with the cases only after they occur. Now, what kind of devices and systems would countries need to detect the signs of child abuse as early as possible?
Well, you need both a big picture and a one-on-one approach. I was quite impressed by how you began this story and this panel by referring to a report by Statistics Korea. At a high level, data is crucial, as well as adopting a public health approach. This means that there's systematic reporting and recording of child abuse, as well as looking at other sources of data which are associated with child abuse. I can give you one very clear example, which is domestic violence, maybe involving spousal violence. In those kinds of cases, you would expect to see police reports, police telephone calls. These kinds of sources of data are very good early warning signs. When and where and why abuse is happening really needs to be independently monitored and analyzed. So you really don't want the same branch of government dealing with child protection that is also looking at the data. You need independent monitors. On the other hand, you need that one-on-one approach I mentioned before. A great example is in the US, they set up this program called the Head Start program, which serves children from birth to early childhood at around 5 or 6 years old, the most critical development age of children. Health and welfare professionals pay regular visits to families with newborns in those vulnerable areas and try to understand their challenges and link them with the resources that are available in the community. They don't wait until there is an incident of abuse.
Right, so data, one-on-one approach, and independent monitoring system would be very important given what our Mr. Marwa says. Now, Professor Cho, many say that a law should be passed that it would create a special investigative committee to look into serious child abuse cases that have occurred within the past 3 years, which is still waiting to be passed by the National Assembly, by the way. But do you believe such a committee would play a key role in preventing further child abuse?
I'm afraid I've yet to come across any committee that's actually done anything effective, really, in preventing these type of abuses. there have been lots of legislative changes in order to try to provide better supervision and better system to monitor child abuse and try to prevent it. For example, just a couple of years ago, the role of monitoring child abuse cases have been transferred from private companies and agencies to public authorities. So now the local councils are responsible for monitoring and supervision. But once again, we suffer from lack of budget and lack of trained personnel. If the special committee is going to be empowered and given the resources to do something tangible about it, then yes, I would say it could make a difference. But given that our current government is actually looking to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality that provides shelter for teenagers who are victims of abuse, I am not really sure if their policies are completely coordinated.
Right. I really hope a proper system and budget, those kind of things could be set up for us to prevent further child abuse. All right, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor Cho and Mr. Marwa, for giving us a better understanding of the delicate issue of child abuse as well as the advice on how to prevent the cases. We appreciate them.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching and goodbye.